Not gonna lie, it pissed me off when bring up Stalin and Mao when I say I'm a social democrat. When they say this, state ran as a dictatorship, not as a democracy. Democracy is the only way leftist government can survive. Well, yeah, I mean the thing that people bring up Stalin and Mao mostly about, I think, with social democrats is something that, like, on rare instances they might be right to, is that Stalin disingenuously argued that that social democracy is the moderate wing of fascism, which is actually true. I've read academic like I've read some theorists from the late 19th century. The social democrats, like, fascism came from social democracy, because, like, the main issue that many socialists, including myself, took with social democracy was that and is that it is still an ideology contingent on a capitalistic bedrock. You know, where it's basically it's almost like a better version of what China is doing, keeping a very, very tight leash on the capital class while permitting said class to exist. Here, I'll just ban this person. You know, Hitler even joked about having been a social democrat before he created the Nazi Party. You know, so there's something there, right? But, like, fundamentally, social democracy, it was tried, and it had many great successes. The NLRA, which established the NLRB, the Public Works Administration, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of these things that we rely on that are bedrocks of American civil society, all the welfare programs in Europe, all of their, you know, single-payer healthcare systems and stuff like that. All of those are successes of social democracy, but because they didn't fundamentally alter the relationship between labor and capital, they still allowed for private ownership. They left themselves susceptible to being eroded over time. Those gains were rolled back because they didn't basically, like, reform their way into socialism. They stopped. You know? But yes, obviously, democracy is like the most stable form of society, and any socialist system would necessarily be democratic. That's kind of what makes it socialism, is that you are extending the bounds to which democracy applies. You know, I have a video on this. I talk about what influences my socialist politics very briefly. You know, but in a country like the USSR or in China, that, you know, that's not socialism. Number one, there's no worker ownership of economic production, but then number two, the hierarchy of the state is still present, which means you still have a ruling class and a class that is ruled, or a class that functionally owns all of the things and material forces of society and gets to command them, and a class that is to be commanded and ruled over. And that is, like, living on the margins, despite composing the vast majority of society. You know? Like, the term state capitalism doesn't exist for nothing. They also chose the candidates? Yes, that's right. In fact, that's kind of how they maintained the veneer of, like, being a socialist state or whatever. They're like, oh, haha, see, we have a democratic process, but, like, the party council or whatever chose all the candidates and, like, pre-selected for who was even allowed to run, or, you know, all that stuff. Literally in the last season of Legend of Korra, it's like Hitler was just misguided. Yeah, true. It's a one-party system over there? Yeah. Saw this one joke, where it said one of the Avengers stop Russia from invading Ukraine. True. If only. Yeah, one-party systems fucking suck. That's why America and China both suck. In part, at least. That's one reason why they both suck. Again, it's like, they wanted all the Avengers to stop Russia from invading Ukraine. Yeah, true. We'll never get that, though. That'd be too based. Yeah. Yeah, the Luxemburgist critique, which I can really see where she was coming from because of what happened to the social democratic movement in Europe, is basically that there were some moderate elements of the socialist movement, right? That advocated for reforming into socialism, which on some level I still believe is a fundamentally good idea, because you have to have a multifaceted approach if you have such a big political project. But they discounted revolution as a possibility. They strictly wanted to reform, which was already a major concession that was made. And Luxemburg spends plenty of time lambasting the reformists. But those reformists turned into non-socialist social democrats. People like Edward Bernstein, and Karl Kautsky, I believe, was another one. These were the early social democrats of Europe that diverged from socialism and said that it's okay for us to keep the market-based private ownership model of production, so long as the state is an agent of the working class rather than the owning class. They started to basically abandon the revolutionary aspect of upending the class relationship and molding society into something stateless, classless, and moneyless. They abandoned that mission, right? Then the Social Democrats further leaned into these concessions. They started saying, well, actually, this whole class warfare thing is extremely detrimental to society. Again, an observation that many socialists have made, and is the bedrock for a lot of socialist thought, that the class conflict has to be resolved. The Social Democrats started arguing that instead of obliterating the class relationship by creating a classless society, why not simply reconcile the interests of the two classes, right? The owning class and the working class, the capitalists and the laborers. And you could do so under the auspice of the state. The state could be used as a tool to bridge the gap between the interests of the working class and the interests of the owning class. And that is where fascism's origins lie in a modern sense. The class reconciliation, the class collaborationism, as it was called, is the bedrock of fascist ideology in Nazi Germany, in Italy, and in America today. That the state is the end unto which society exists, and the sole function of the state is basically to keep the classes in line, in their proper places, which means cementing the class hierarchy with the owning class on top and the working class on the bottom, where they currently exist. That is how a series of academics and politicians broke from socialism and slowly conceded their way, very neoliberally so. They literally made end of history arguments while doing this, saying that we've done all the history, the normal class dynamics don't apply anymore because we'll just be nice now, smiley face. They did that cycle, the exact cycle we're witnessing the Democratic Party do now, until they had ideologically reached fascism. In fact, I mentioned that Hitler joked about being a social democrat when somebody at like a Nazi party meeting was accused of being a social democrat and spying for the opposition. He said, oh, we've all been social democrats at one time or another. And in fact, Hitler's own description of the National Socialist platform, the Nazi platform, was, in his words, not mine, a form of national social democracy. When you stop focusing on the class elements, with the underlying issues that create like a steadily worsening and consolidating society, and when you shift your focus towards the state and the state basically as not just a means to an end, such that the state may no longer exist someday, but as the end unto itself, you very, very quickly bridge from left-leaning social democracy into fascism. It's the far-right pipeline. It was, in fact, the far-right pipeline of its day, because the nationalism of the 19th and 20th centuries was sort of the soup du jour that led to conversations in politics being centered around the state. National self-determination, freedom of nations, which effectively meant the freedom for the state, which meant freedom for the owning class. you know? I meant socialist democracy. That's okay. That's okay. Look, it's all good. Didn't know there was a difference between social democracy and socialist democracy. You know, that's the crazy thing. Originally, there wasn't. Luxemburg actually talks about the socialist future. She uses the terms socialism, communism, and social-democracy interchangeably. Those three terms were interchangeable at the time because the divide was only just beginning to show, right? Many of the socialists envisioned socialism as a project of social democracy, as in the extension of democracy more into social life to fix the problems of alienation that people were facing in the workplace, right? But yeah, nowadays, there is a substantial difference where a lot of social democrats, people that call themselves social democrats, can be anywhere from kind of like lefties who haven't quite found their footing to centrists that hate socialism but vaguely like the idea of taxing the rich more. I wish that liberal was a slur and I can use it. I'm going to give you some great news. Anything is a slur if you're brave enough. If you want to use the word liberal as a slur, you can use it as a slur. I know I do. But yeah, bro, the boss. It's a really interesting, like, storied ideological journey that's you know, that came around as a product of like capitalism going from one stage to the next, and all this like technological advancement and changes in the processes of production and whatever that were happening at the tail end of the or not even the tail end, throughout the 19th century, you know. Luxemburg even predicts by name National Socialism, which is fucking crazy. She was right, like, she wrote this shit in 1896. I think the essay she wrote about this in, you know, the growing divide between the social democrats and the socialists, and their over-reliance on nationalism and the state as the artifice through which all politics happens, and stuff like that. She literally predicts that these increasingly nationalist social democrats will invent a new ideology that is still, like, in some way grounded in the old socialist ideas immediately post-liberal revolutions, but they will call it National Socialism because it is socialism, but solely applied to the state. The state gets to own things. The people do not. You know? I had to like double and triple check that what year the essay was written in, and it was written in 1896. Sure enough, 1920 something, you get the National Socialist German Workers' Party, courtesy of like Adolf Hitler and some other weirdos. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Sometimes I hate words. Yeah, it's true. When I didn't have my footing, I was basically an anarchist without knowing the word. That's cool. Yeah, words are complicated. Also, it is worth noting, if you hear some of the stuff that the average European social democrat has to say, it is really, really easy to see how social democracy turns into fascism and national socialism. Like, you know, those social democrats will say stuff about protecting the welfare state and whatever, but then just fucking ask them their opinion about immigration and, like, I don't know, like Serbians or something. Now, about Serbians specifically, they might be cooking, but like, ask them their opinion of Turkish people, you're gonna hear some extremely racist shit, you know? And that's because that's your brain on the politics of nationalism and not the politics of class. And the politics of like, systemic root causes of issues. Thanks for watching, and support the channel if you would be so kind.